So first things first, normally when we talk about supplement programs on different stuff, I tend to put mineral kind of at the end of the discussion. But for corn residue in particular, I want to address it up front in the beginning because uh, corn residue is a winter dormant forage. Um, it is for all classes of animal, whether you're grazing stockers and replacement heifers, or even some of your fall calving cows, spring gestating calving, or spring calving gestating cows. These all need a mineral supplement. So when we say you can get by with unsupplemented spring gestating cattle, unsupplemented in protein and energy, they still need a mineral supplement in order to meet their needs. That is driven by this corn residue being low in a variety of vitamins and minerals. So in particular, when you're looking at a mineral tag and what we need to meet, pay attention to your vitamin A, phosphorus, copper, and zinc while you're grazing corn residue. The other points I like to make talking to people, if you're somebody who likes to order in bulk, which there's good reason to, right? Or even if you're getting a custom mineral mix to kind of control your costs that way, uh, minerals, those mineral mixes do have a little bit of a shelf life. The minerals themselves are generally okay, but the vitamins in particular, uh, we try to we the general rule is about a 6 month shelf life, and so if you're and that's the vitamins in our green growing forages in the spring and summer tend to be adequate, but in these dormant forages, definitely need supplemented. And so, something to consider. If you're buying in bulk, try to target refreshing your mineral stores in the winter rather than in the summer when they're going on to a vitamin-rich feed. Another thing to consider when you're looking at mineral tags, pay attention to if they're formulated for a season. So I said pay attention to those particular minerals, but in general, you can compare what's considered a summer mineral to a winter mineral, and those are some of the differences you'll see just because dormant forages in general, but especially corn residue, will be needing some of those. And so, along with what's in the mineral, the other big thing I want to emphasize is how much mineral. Um, it's always interesting going to different listening sessions or producer meetings, and you talk to producers and conversations, and oh, what would be your ideal cow? What do you want out of your cows? We're like, well, I want one that doesn't need mineral supplement. Well, that'd be great. Yeah, we understand it's a significant cost, but um, kind of hard to do. So a lot of guys you hear, or I hear frequently complaining anyways, because it's an expense, is uh, they're just going through so much. They eat it, they eat it, they eat it. But I would challenge you to make sure you go through the math a little bit. Um, this is just a quick table going through the math, assuming a 4 ounce per head per day is the target intake, which is pretty common on most minerals. There's some that are 8 or vary a little bit, but um, and figure out how many bags of mineral for how many head you have out there should you be going through to reach that average target intake. It is interesting to, I mean, there's variations across individuals, but on average is what you're looking for. And a lot of times, I mean, it can be surprising. I'm like, oh, I need 15 bags of minerals for my month with 100 head, and it might be more than you're expecting. And so if you are, if you run through that and you're like, no, I'm really going through the mineral too fast after a week or two, there's strategies to help mitigate that by utilizing salt to uh, control intake a little bit. There's also instances where the cattle really aren't going through the mineral very well, and there's some mentality where like, oh, they're not eating it, they don't need it. But in reality, cattle aren't necessarily smart eaters. They just eat what tastes good, right? And so if you're significantly lower than what your target average intake should be, you might want to be looking at different ways on, or if there's any palatability issues, if your minerals in a location that they just don't access very well and you need to move it to a area they tend to go to more often or not. But that's something, actually track how many bags of mineral you put out and when with how many head to figure out how your intake is matching up. Okay, I'm not going to talk about mineral again unless you guys end up bringing it up mineral questions. But I wanted to make sure I went through that first, uh, just as that being the supplement that all these cattle need while grazing residue. So um, now getting into just supplement program, nutritional needs, supplemental programs for other classes of animals. But there's essentially two primary questions you have to ask is A, what's the residue's feed value? And B, what does the animal that's grazing that residue need to meet your performance goals? So that might be a maintenance requirement, that might be growing cattle wanting to be 1 pound per day gain or 2 pounds per day gain. And so that needs to be in the back of your mind. This slide Mary talked about in her discussion earlier, and so I won't dwell on it really, but when we're looking at residue feed quality over a grazing period with targeting that 50% husk and leaf utilization, if we're going out an extended period of time, cattle selectivity plays a huge role in that diet quality that they're eating. And so they're going to start their grazing period eating at a lot higher quality diet than they will at the end of the grazing period, even if it's a shorter grazing period that's stocked at a higher density. So over time, cattle will be limited by diet quality because as that decreases, but also they said it just takes them a little longer to find stuff that they want to eat. I mean, if you have a bunch of cookies out there, going to eat a lot faster than if you're stuck to the least favorite vegetables, all that's left on the table, right? Um, Another part to that is we talk about the digestibility of those plant parts. As you eat the good stuff that tastes good, those are also the higher digestible portions of the fraction. And then over time, you get stuck eating more fibrous components as well. And some of that limitation can reduce that intake as well. And so a lot of times you'll hear general nutrition discussions say, we'll just assume 2.5% body weight intake, go from there. Corn residue, you need to adjust that a little bit because even at the beginning of the grazing season, when Mary showed this chart earlier, she had highlighted, but they're at about a 2.2% body weight intake. And then by the end of that 60 days, it had dropped to about 1.4% body weight intake for, and so there is an effect there that adds another limitation to them. For when we're looking at different plant parts of that residue and the nutritional value, when they go out there, they're selecting the grain, the highest or most digestible portion. So this figure here has both TDN, which is a indication of energy, right? And also crude protein on the right-hand y-axis and TDN on the left. But grain highest in TDN followed by husk, leaf, cob, and stem. Protein doesn't exactly follow that, although it's, when we're looking at this, gives you a decent idea of looking at those plant parts and puts some perspective of how that quality decreases over time as they select those higher, more digestible, more palatable plant parts initially in the grazing period and aren't limited versus later. And Mary also talked about the residue makeup, especially initially, but our primary focus being on that husk and leaf combination that make up around 40% of the residue fraction in the field. The other big factor that will impact grazing days, the general quality of the forage, what's out there, can kind of wrap up into just growing conditions of that growing season. And so every year's different. Fortunately, at least in my immediate area and a decent area in Iowa, we've had really ideal growing conditions this year. We've had spots of where there were some significant hailstorms, there were tornadoes and things in the spring, obviously, but in general, we didn't have super consistent rain throughout, but we had enough moisture and we had great growing conditions. We didn't have a derecho go through that caused widespread down corn issues like in previous years. So the picture here is actually from I think 2020 derecho, and it just is a good picture to show after harvest how much residue was still left in the field that was down and not picked up, and how much grain was out there. And then those situations are when we get into conversations of, okay, that is way too much corn out there for my cows coming off of pasture. How can I even utilize it without making them go acidotic and get sick and bloat? And there are strategies to manage that, but again, growing condition variations, if cows were not at a bloat risk and turned out on that, they'd get pretty fat pretty quick, because that's a lot of corn out there available for them to get. But in addition to weather and down corn being a primary change in what's the nutrient value is, but there's also various diseases that can come through the cornfield. Last year we had a lot of tar spot questions, different molds, etc., things that may or may not impact quality of that forage for the grazing period, but being able to identify those, and on a every year individual basis, figuring out if you need to take unique actions because of that growing condition year, and act accordingly. And even just rainfall, whether it was a drought year or not, whether you're under irrigated, there's data that shows protein differences between those type of growing conditions for that plant, which makes sense. Now, the other part I wanted to talk about, and Mary alluded to that, I'd be talking about it, is how has residue changed a little bit, specifically with yield. So this is actually a Nebraska study. I'm an Iowa State person, but I'll do my best to do this study justice. They did a 2-year study that very recently in 2021 and 22, where the objective was to investigate if yield was correlated to residue yield. So more grain yield if we still are getting proportionally the same residue yield increase. Also plant proportions within that residue yield, and then the digestibility of those plant portions in that residue. If there are differences as our grain yields have increased over time, or just looking at variety differences. So in 2021, there were 24 hybrids evaluated at 4 locations, and in 2022, there were 26 hybrids evaluated at 3 locations. So moving into some of the results they had here, this first figure is comparing residue yield to grain yield. And so as grain yield increased, we did see that the residue yield increased. However, if you look at the slope and the correlations there, the biomass as the grain yield increased is a higher proportion of grain and less residue, which it's still going up, just not quite as much as the grain yield goes up, right? So that's pretty much the goal of what some of the plant breeders have been going for. You want more of the energy of the plant going into grain production. So it makes sense and was somewhat expected for those higher yielding higher yielding plants to have that effect. Now we've spent quite a bit of time talking about how really, when it comes to residue, what we care about as cattlemen are the leaf and husk portions of it. And so even though we know the residue total production itself was increasing a little bit at a slower rate than the grain yield, but how's that leaf and husk specifically break down? So that's what this figure here illustrates. So when we look at the proportion of the residue, either leaf is in the green dots, husk is in the blue, and then compare that to the grain yield bushel per acre on the x-axis. But the nice thing, it's positive for us, is as that grain yield increased, the leaf and husk specifically as a proportion of the residue increased as well. So there is more leaf and husk available with that higher yielding stuff, higher yielding corn, and we'll kind of connect the dots here in the next couple slides. Now the third objective was to evaluate the digestibility of the residue as that grain yield increased. which is what is shown here. So they did in vitro analysis on the residue plant fractions. And so on the y-axis is digestible organic matter, which is a pretty good proxy for TDN, which is what we primarily use when we're talking about energy content of a feed. But as our grain yields increased, our digestibility of both the leaf and husk decreased over that time. So that, unlike the last slide, is not exactly what we'd want to see, but again, it's just what it is. And it makes sense to support the plant, but needing a little more fibrous plant that might be less digestible to support some of those higher grain yields too as well. But if we connect the dots from the 3 previous slides, what we're really wanting to get down to is how many pounds of TDN is available for those cattle to eat as those yields increases, and how that changes. And so what this does is, or what this figure shows, is the pounds per bushel of digestible organic matter compared to grain yield. And in general, as you can see in the trend line, it decreases as yield increases. And so even though we had a higher proportion of leaf and husk available in the field with that residue, the digestibility of that leaf and husk wasn't decreased enough to impact the total pounds of digestible energy to a degree. So the next question comes to, do we need to adjust our stocking rates? And we'll get into that a little bit. But in general, those higher yielding corn varieties and fields aren't as nutrient dense for the cattle grazing as the lower yielding. So the big question is, can cattle still meet their needs in the higher yielding fields if we're using the current stocking rates? And so if we look at the current rates, looking at the UNL's NEB guide, the pounds of digestible organic matter, we kind of around that 25 range, but based on the numbers found in this experiment, the utilization needed to meet those requirements is, for the lower yielding field, starts down at around 40% to that 250 yielding, higher yielding, getting up to that 56%. And essentially, when we're targeting that, that's indicating that we need to adjust our stocking rates a little bit. And so if we take that and go into days, is probably the easiest or most straightforward way to look at it, I guess. If we talked, or Mary mentioned a few times, targeting that 50% utilization of leaf and husk as being the primary goal for where we want to be. It might be a little conservative, depending on your perspective, but in order for those cows to not need, or those calving gestating cows to not need supplemented, that's the target recommendation that we have. As our yields increase, we have the leaf and husk. Our traditional recommendations would say around 27 days of grazing to hit that 50% utilization. And that's where we're actually hitting on some of our higher yielding ones based on that data, but we do see that changes as we go over, and that's we just ultimately have less flexibility and in how many grazing days that we have. You might your estimate when you're figuring it is at the very max rather than having some flexibility within that. That's evaluating what's out in the field, and Mary had talked about determining stocking rates a bit, about that. Our general thumb rule being one animal or one cow per month per 100 bushels out in the field, bushel per acre. But the next part I wanted to talk about before we get into some specific scenarios was looking at different classes of animals and specifically breaking down their needs based on that, because there are a lot of scenarios where we do need a supplement. And so for growing cattle, your big questions are, what are their starting weight what's their target gain. And then I also threw in implanted or not in there, mostly with the mentality, if you're going to plant your cattle, you want to make sure they have enough groceries to utilize the benefit of that implant. When we're looking at gestating cattle and pregnant, what is their age? Are they still growing some, or are they fully mature? What is their mature weight, general cow size? What body condition score are they started, or are they at when you're turning them out? And what is your goal to maintain them, or have increased body condition score, or do you need to decrease body condition score some? So there's variation in that, and similar questions when you get to lactating cattle for our fall calving herds. But for a lot of this will be their peak lactation, and then milk yield potential is a really big component in determining what their feed needs will be in that. So I'm going to run through a few example scenarios, but the primary, or on all of them, I'm general assumptions. That figure earlier that shows the digestibility change over time for the grazing period is where pull the TDN estimates from. Higher quality feed when you turn out, lower by the time you're hitting that 50% utilization. In this example, we're assuming around 60 days. And then protein, I'm sure this is high, but giving the animal the benefit of the doubt that they're selecting the best stuff out there, and then that there's some recycling that does happen, but assumed 8% to 4% by the end of the grazing period. So that energy is probably pretty target. Protein's probably a little high, but that's what we are using for our assumptions today. So this figure here, we're going to talk about growing cattle first. So you can look at replacement heifers you're developing or stocker steer calves out there pretty similarly. Not exactly, but if we're assuming we have a 600-pound steer out there and we're trying to hit 1.5 pounds per day gain, the dotted lines are kind of an indicator of where their energy and protein requirements land. And then those solid lines are from that table I just showed you with the corn residue quality assumptions, where they hit and how that changes over that 60-day grazing period. And so obviously, I want to emphasize there's not any point where the corn residue is really meeting their needs if you're wanting them to hit that 1.5 pound target gain. And then by the end of the grazing period, that gap significantly widens. So if you did the math and used a 2% body weight assumption for their intake, that equates to, in the beginning of the season, needing about 0.5 pound TDN and protein supplemented, and at the end of the season needing almost 4 pounds of TDN and 1 pound of crude protein. Most supplement programs will shoot for the average and keep it consistent throughout the feeding period, but you don't have to. You can increase it as the days go on as well. So that's the other thing I wanted to talk about with growing cattle, which I guess I'll talk about it next, kind of why the supplement composition matters. But when we're trying to hit those target gains, there is it's actually a fairly linear relationship for if you're wanting them to gain more, you feed them more or supplement them more. Not shocking, right? So this is a pooled analysis done by Cody Welshons at UNL while he was there, and it was looking at the level of distillers grains supplemented on a % body weight basis and compared that to the average daily gain of calves. So there were 3 different studies he used in this pooled analysis, all done at that Mead location actually. And then I think all of them were dried distillers except for the 2014 study had both dried and modified distillers, but between the two, they weren't different. And so they pooled those performance points together. But anyways, it was a fairly linear relationship. And so I think Connor even mentioned it earlier for the study, the chopping residue study, they had that 1.5 pound target for their average daily gain. And so to hit that, this you would want to be feeding around 0.6% of the body weight in distillers. And so these were for foreign, or well, I think it was about 5 weight cattle. I think that 450 to 520 was the average range on these studies, but the relationship is there and you can do that. The other thing I wanted to mention that I started alluding to is the supplement composition matters with these growing cattle. So Tibbetts and others at UNL again compared specifically corn and dried distillers grains as a supplement program. So they had 4 different treatments. One was unsupplemented, one was just corn, one was corn and urea, and one was dried distillers grains. They were all formulated to hit, well, other than there was the unsupplemented control, but the 3 supplement programs were formulated to have the same pounds of TDN or pounds of energy delivered to animals. And then on the protein side, the corn obviously didn't have a protein supplement component, but the corn plus urea and the distillers were formulated to have really close to the same pounds of protein provided to these animals. And so then when we look at the actual performance of these calves, why we talk about the composition of the supplement mattering, or is the distillers grains significantly outperformed all other groups. The corn and urea still outperformed the corn and the control, in which the control had actually lost weight, which isn't surprising. But that distillers group significantly outperformed, and there's a few reasons for this, primarily being the primary one being these are growing cattle. High quality protein is important. So distillers grains, we talk about them being a source of ruminally undegradable protein, versus urea is the protein source for the corn and urea group. And we call that a ruminally degradable protein. And the difference between that degradable protein is essentially degraded in the rumen or utilized in the rumen. I like to think of that protein as the protein that's feeding the bugs or the bacteria. And then that undegradable protein that's in the distillers that's getting bypassed into the small intestine, and that's protein that's being utilized by the animal. And so that's just something I want to point out. You can use corn as a supplement while grazing corn residue, but it doesn't complement the corn residue to get the performance benefits to the level that other supplement options will. Going out of growing cattle, I'll do a couple quick examples of some of the other animals that would need supplemented. So if we're looking at our spring calving herd, I didn't go back and fix this, but the first and second calvers, so the first calf heifer and even that animal going into her second calf are still growing. They still have higher requirements than those mature animals. So even though I have 1,400-pound mature weight, so that's the target for when they're 4 or 5 years old is where we'd expect them to be. They're a little bigger. When we look at the ability of corn residue to meet their requirements, initially for energy is sufficient, but protein, it's pretty close to whether it's meeting them or not initially, probably not by the book anyways. And so it just shows that they will need supplemented. We'll talk about how much here in a minute. And then if we look and do a fall calving example of a fall calving mature cow, who is 1,400 pounds, body condition score, calf September 1st. If we're turning her out October 1st, when the residue is first available, she needs supplemented pretty much the entire time for both protein and energy. At the very beginning, arguably not energy supplement needed, but I did make some things to consider with this. I did assume that it was a high milking Angus cow. and that she is just getting into that peak lactation time frame. So then if we look for those two examples on how much what that supplement program might look like, I'm using distiller's grains in this examples, but if we assume a 2% body weight intake, just to simplify it a little bit, early in the grazing period, that spring calving, young first and second calver, didn't need or only needed a little bit of protein to meet her needs. But by the end of the grazing, 60 days with that 50% utilization target, needed 2.2 and 1.23 pounds of TDN and protein supplemented. So that would equate to about 2.5 to 3 pounds of distillers. And then fall calving, mature cow, going back to that, or that higher lactation need, that higher demand for those animals, needing almost a pound of protein right off the bat, and then almost 6 pounds of energy and 2 pounds of protein later, which would equate to 4.5 to 5 pounds of distillers. Now, a few things I didn't really talk about specifically, but I wanted to mention. I mean, I use distillers in these examples. You don't have to. We have gluten feed, corn. There's all kinds of supplement options out there. And my biggest thing when we talk about selecting supplements, I want to emphasize is just making sure you're pricing your local outlet to get that supplement, price that supplement on pounds per limiting nutrient that you need. So for these examples, protein being limiting nutrient, price that pounds per dry pounds per protein, with that supplement cost being delivered to the farm ready to go. And then I guess with that, we'll kind of take any questions here and wrap up. I know a lot of guys are out in the field. Corn harvest is well underway in this region, and so we'll be respectful of your time there. So